Did you know that Oedipus's fate was sealed the moment he was born? A terrible prophecy foretold that he would kill his own father and marry his mother. And the worst part, he tried to escape it all. But despite his efforts to change the course of his life, Oedipus couldn't escape what was destined to happen. In this video, we'll take you on an epic journey of mistakes, mysteries, and tragedies that shaped the life of one of the most famous figures in Greek mythology. How did he fulfill his destiny without knowing? What truly happened that led his life down this path? Get ready to uncover the secrets of this fascinating story. Stay until the end, because what you're about to see will surprise you. Let's dive into the riddle of Oedipus and understand how fate does not forgive. So, if you think you're ready to see this story in a way you've never seen before, keep watching. At the top of Mount Parnassus, surrounded by sacred valleys and groves, lay the Oracle of Delphi, one of the most mysterious and respected places in ancient Greece. Inside the grand temple dedicated to Apollo, a woman known as Pythia had the gift of seeing the future. She sat upon a bronze tripod, high above a crack in the earth from which strange vapors rose. It was said that these were the remnants of the ancient serpent Python, defeated by Apollo himself. When Pythia inhaled the magical air, her eyes rolled back, her body trembled, and her voice distorted as she brought forth messages from the god of prophecy. Kings, generals, and even simple peasants traveled for weeks to hear her words. Some came seeking hope, others feared her answers. But one thing was certain: no one left there the same way they entered. The fate of entire empires had already been determined there and now. A king of Thebes was approaching, unaware that his question would forever change the history of his family and the entire city. In Thebes, King Laius and Queen Jocasta finally had a reason to celebrate. After years of trying, Jocasta had given birth to a son. The birth of the prince brought joy to the palace, and the gods seemed to bless the city. The people celebrated, the priests made offerings, and the musicians filled the streets with songs of hope. But Laius couldn't fully rejoice. There was something in his past that haunted him. Many years earlier, he had been warned about a terrible prophecy, a grim warning that if he ever had a son, that boy would grow up to kill him and marry Jocasta, his own mother. The king tried to ignore the fear, but as he looked at the a baby in his arms, doubt grew within him. What if the prophecy was true? What if instead of securing the continuation of his lineage, this child was the instrument of his ruin? Laius knew he needed answers, so he made a decision. He would go to Delphi and consult the oracle. He hoped Apollo would give him some reassurance, some comforting word, but what he heard from Pythia made his blood run cold. "The fate has already been sealed, Laius. Your own son will be your killer and your wife's husband. Nothing can change that." It was as if the gods had written the end before the story even began. The king returned to Thebes with a heavy heart. He looked at Jocasta and the baby sleeping in his cradle and knew he had a terrible choice ahead. He would never allow this prophecy to come true. The prophecy echoed in Laius's mind like an incessant thunder. He knew that if he didn't act immediately, fate would follow its relentless course. He couldn't allow his own son to become his killer and, worse, marry Jocasta. No matter how much his heart hesitated, he believed he had to act. In the darkness of his chambers, he summoned a trusted servant. With a cold and determined voice, he ordered, "Take the boy and carry him far away. He cannot live." The man's eyes widened, surprised by the order. It was common for kings to make difficult decisions, but to eliminate their own newborn child, this was brutal even by the standards of the time. "Your Majesty, is something so extreme really necessary?" the servant dared to ask. "There's no other choice," Laius roared. "If this baby lives, he will bring disgrace to me, to Jocasta, and to all of Thebes." Jocasta, who had been listening from the other side of the linen curtain, felt her heart tighten. She entered the chamber with tears in her eyes, holding the baby gently. "Laius, please. He's our son. There are other solutions. We can send him to another kingdom, give him to a distant family. But don't kill our baby." But Laius wouldn't relent. The prophecy spoke too loudly. He grabbed Jocasta by the shoulders and, with a grave look, whispered, "If we let this child live, I will be dead. And you will be married to him. Is that what you want?" The words hit her like a blade. She looked at the child, so small and defenseless, and then at Laius, whose expression had hardened with fear. It seemed fate had already decided for them. With tears streaming down her face, Jocasta said nothing more. She only held the baby to her chest one last time before handing him over to the servant, who would leave to carry out the king's cruel order. Under the cold mantle of the night, the servant left the gates of Thebes with the baby in his arms. He rode through hills and valleys, crossing deserted roads, until he found a secluded place far enough to carry out the king's order. But as he looked at the child, something inside him broke. The boy was so small, so fragile. How could he take his life? He had followed difficult orders before, but this one seemed too cruel. Still, he feared defying Laius. So, instead of killing the baby, he decided to find a way to leave him to the mercy of fate. He took a rope and tied the child's ankles, tightening them firmly until the skin marked. Then he hung the boy from a tree branch, high enough to keep him away from animals but vulnerable to the elements. If the gods wanted him to die, let them do it themselves. The wind howled through the mountains, and the night seemed darker than ever. The servant gave one last look at the child, murmuring a silent prayer before leaving, not looking back. But fate had already made its choice. A few hours later, a group of shepherds wandering the area heard a faint cry coming from the trees. Curious, they approached and, to their astonishment, found a baby hanging there, his ankles swollen from the ropes. "What cruelty is this? Who would do such a thing?" one of them murmured, carefully taking the boy down. The shepherds didn't know who the child was or why he had been abandoned, but one thing was certain: he couldn't stay there. One of them, who had connections at the Corinthian palace, decided to take him to King Polybus and Queen Merope. And so, unknowingly, the gods themselves guided Oedipus to a new home and placed him one step closer to the fate Laius so feared. The shepherds traveled to Corinth, where King Polybus and Queen Merope ruled wisely, but carried a deep sadness. They had never been able to have children. When the shepherd presented the abandoned baby to the king, with his little feet swollen, from the ropes, Polybus felt a mix of compassion and hope. "The gods have brought him to us," he said, taking the child in his arms. Merope approached and, upon looking at the baby, felt a warmth fill her heart. He could be the answer to the years of emptiness and unfulfilled desire. Without hesitation, she took him in her arms and held him close to her chest. "He will be our son," she declared firmly. And so, the boy was raised as the Prince of Corinth. He was given the name Oedipus, meaning swollen feet, due to the scars left by the ropes. He grew up surrounded by love and privilege, educated by the best teachers and trained in the arts of war and leadership. To everyone, he was the legitimate heir to the throne, and Polybus and Merope never told him the truth about his origins. But fate, always patient, awaited the right moment to reveal the truth. And that moment would come sooner than Oedipus imagined. Although Oedipus was deeply loved by his adoptive parents, there was something inside him that he couldn't silence. From a young age, he overheard whispers and rumors about his true origins. Some said he wasn't Polybus and Merope's biological son. Others suggested that there was something mysterious about his arrival in Corinth. These murmurs began to affect him as he grew. He would look at Polybus and Merope and feel a disconnection, a doubt that troubled him. as if a crucial piece of his own puzzle were missing. With every loving glance from his adoptive mother or wise word from his father, he wondered, who am I, really? With the weight of this growing doubt on his shoulders, Oedipus made a decision. He would journey to Delphi and consult the oracle. The search for the truth about his origins was a need that could not be ignored, and he believed that the oracle of Apollo, the source of all divine answers, would help him understand his true identity. The journey from Corinth to Delphi was long and arduous, but Oedipus did not hesitate. He traveled alone, guided only by the need to find something that would give him peace. When he finally arrived at the Temple of Apollo, the atmosphere seemed heavy with the promise of revelations. He entered the sacred hall of Delphi, where Pythia, the priestess of the oracle, awaited him. His eyes narrowed as he saw her, seated upon the tripod, enveloped by the mystical smoke rising from the earth. With a slow, solemn gesture, the priestess looked at him and spoke, her voice echoing through the temple. "What do you seek, son?" Of Corinth, Oedipus, with his heart racing, declared, "I want to know my true origin. Am I the legitimate son of Polybus and Merope? Who am I, really?" But the oracle, as always, had other plans. The words that left Pythia's mouth were far darker than he had expected. "You will kill your father and marry your mother." The air seemed to freeze around him. The answer was not about his origin, but about a terrible fate awaiting him. The prophecy left Oedipus speechless, paralyzed by the horrific image forming in his mind. Desperate and stunned, he didn't know what to do. The only thing he knew was that he had to flee, to escape everything he knew so that this terrifying future would not come to pass. Oedipus left the Temple of Delphi with his mind on fire. The priestess's words still echoed in his ears like a deafening scream. "You will kill your father and marry your mother." How could this be possible? He could never allow such a fate to unfold. The young prince was consumed by panic. What could he do to escape this curse? Confusion overtook his heart as he wandered aimlessly through the streets of Delphi, his eyes fixed on the ground, his mind clouded. He knew he could not return to Corinth. If he went back there, the prophecy would come true, or at least that's what he believed. His father, Polybus, and mother Merope could be destroyed by his very existence, by his mere presence. The thought of killing a man he called father and then marrying the woman who had raised him seemed unbearable. With fear coursing through his veins, he made a desperate decision. If he fled Corinth, he could avoid the curse from being fulfilled. He would go far away, to a place where no one knew his name or origin, where the weight of destiny would not find him. Without saying goodbyes, Oedipus left Delphi and took to unfamiliar roads, determined to escape everything that tied him to his past. He believed that by going anywhere else, he could avoid the tragedy that awaited him. But what he didn't know was that in trying to flee from fate, he was simply setting his journey toward it in motion. Oedipus wandered for weeks, leaving Corinth further and further behind. His mind was confused, and the fear of the future consumed him. He sought a place where he wouldn't be recognized, where he could live without the weight of the prophecy crushing his chest. The journey, though solitary, seemed like a desperate escape from himself, as if he could outrun what had already been written. It was on a distant road, surrounded by mountains and dense forests, that fate found him in a cruel twist. While traveling in his chariot, he came across a group of travelers. The road was narrow and the terrain rugged. As the chariots approached, tension mounted. The drivers of the two chariots began arguing over who should yield, neither wanting to move to the narrower side of the road. The argument quickly escalated, with sharp words exchanged, until voices were raised in shouts. Impatient and irritated by the delay, Oedipus shouted for them to move, but the men didn't listen. One of the travelers, An older man with an arrogant demeanor descended from his chariot and in a fit of rage began insulting Oedipus. The young man, already tense and concerned about the lost time, couldn't control his anger. Without knowing who these people were or understanding the gravity of his own impulsiveness, Oedipus, in a fit of rage, attacked the man with his sword. The fight was brief but brutal. When the man fell, dead, Oedipus breathed deeply, relieved by the violence, but unaware of what he had just done. He looked at the fallen body, unaware that he had just killed his true father, Laius, the king of Thebes, whose life had already been foretold in a prophecy that he himself had tried to avoid. Not knowing who he truly was, and not understanding the connection to the man he had just killed, Oedipus continued on, unaware that tragedy was about to unfold in an even more terrifying way. As Oedipus continued his aimless journey, a distant city, Thebes, was suffering a great calamity. The inhabitants lived in terror, ready to give up the life they knew. The city was surrounded by a monstrous threat that no one seemed able to face. The Sphinx, a terrifying creature, part woman, part lion, who guarded the entrance to the city. The Sphinx possessed a devastating power. She challenged all who passed with a riddle. Those who failed to answer her riddle were devoured by the beast. And for a time many had tried, but all had failed, and the city was on the brink of collapse. Thebes, without a king to guide it, began to sink into despair. The streets were empty, the markets abandoned, and the people, instead of celebrating their city, mourned the loss of their loved ones, victims of the cruel Sphinx. The throne was vacant, with no one willing to take on the responsibility and solve the tragedy that had taken over the city. When Oedipus arrived in Thebes, tired and confused from his journey, he knew nothing of the calamity affecting the city. He only knew that he needed to rest and find a new direction. But as he arrived at the city gates, he was immediately recognized as the man who could help. The people, desperate, told him of the terrible monster and pleaded for his aid. Upon hearing the story, Oedipus didn't hesitate. He knew he had to face this challenge, one final obstacle in his search for a fate free from the god's grasp. Unaware of the importance of his arrival, he prepared to face the Sphinx. The creature appeared before him with her piercing eyes and majestic body, an imposing and frightening figure. The Sphinx, as was her custom, posed a riddle. In the morning it has 4 legs, in the afternoon 2, and at night 3. What creature is this? Oedipus looked at her, trying to understand. The riddle seemed simple, but the weight of its meaning threatened to crush him. He thought for a moment, his heart beating faster until an idea flashed in his mind. Man, he answered confidently. Frustrated by being challenged, the Sphinx roared and, as if the weight of her own failures was too much to bear, threw herself off a cliff, falling to her death. With the creature's death, the fear and curse that had plagued Thebes vanished. The city, finally free, celebrated Oedipus's victory. They hailed him as a hero, and the people of Thebes, grateful, offered him the throne, unaware that the true tragedy, once again, was lying in wait. With the Sphinx's death and the city of Thebes finally relieved of the threat that had tormented it, the people, in an act of gratitude, went to Oedipus to offer him the crown. They didn't know, of course, how much this man, whom they now regarded as their hero, was in reality immersed in a fate he was desperately trying to avoid. Oedipus, although taken aback by the surprise and honor of being acclaimed as the savior of Thebes, felt a strange sense of sorrow. He had faced the Sphinx, yes, and defeated the monster, but the words of the oracle still hammered in his mind, and the shadow of the prophecy continued to follow him. He thought for a moment about the city and its inhabitants. Living in Corinth no longer seemed like an option, but now, in the face of the offer of the throne of Thebes, he had no choice. It was the only place where he could try to start a new life, unaware that he was already fulfilling part of his terrible prophecy. The people of Thebes hailed him as king, and as was tradition, he married Jocasta, the widow of King Laius, without knowing she was his own mother. The city, finally at peace, saw its days filled with prosperity, and Oedipus, certain that he had overcome a great obstacle, felt a false tranquility settle in his heart. However, deep down, he still felt the weight of the curse that pursued him, a truth he couldn't see, but that was getting closer and closer. With the death of the Sphinx, Thebes breathed a sigh of relief for the first time in many months. The fear that had settled over the city like a thick shadow disappeared, and peace finally returned to reign. The streets filled with life again, the markets became bustling, and the citizens began to believe that the gods had, in some way, granted the city a second chance. Oedipus was welcomed as a true hero, acclaimed by all who saw in him not just an ordinary man, but someone touched by the divine hand. And as a reward for his bravery and intelligence in solving the riddle of the Sphinx, the leaders of Thebes, without hesitation, offered him the throne. But upon accepting the crown, Oedipus didn't know he was merely trading one uncertain fate for another, even crueler one. Jocasta, the widow of King Laius, also didn't know that the man who now took her deceased husband's place was, in fact, her son. She couldn't imagine that by accepting Oedipus as her husband, she was fulfilling the prophecy that she and Laius had tried to avoid at all costs. When Oedipus married Jocasta, he was convinced that everything he had done until then, the fight against the Sphinx, his rise to the throne, represented a new beginning, a chance for him to escape the fate foretold by the oracle. He wanted to believe he could be happy. His confidence in the future seemed renewed, and he ruled with wisdom, always seeking the well-being of the people of Thebes. The first years of his reign were prosperous. The city flourished under his leadership, and peace reigned. Oedipus had children with Jocasta, and happiness seemed to finally materialize, a reward for his victory and courage. But as always, fate was approaching, and the truth with its unstoppable force hid in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Oedipus's reign was marked by a long era of prosperity for Thebes. The city flourished, its lands were fertile, and trade was thriving. Under his leadership, justice prevailed, and the people lived in peace, without the nightmares that had haunted them before his arrival. The city's wounds seemed healed, and the trust in their king had never been stronger. Oedipus, with his wisdom and courage, had won the heart of the people of Thebes. Alongside Jocasta, he ruled with balance, making careful decisions to maintain harmony among the citizens. Together, the couple had children, and the royal family seemed to embody the love and stability the city so desperately needed. Oedipus and Jocasta were proud parents of healthy, intelligent children, and happiness seemed like a permanent fixture in their lives. But no matter how well the city was doing, there was an underlying tension that couldn't be ignored. Oedipus, always attentive to his people, couldn't shake the unease in his heart, a vague sense that perhaps something was about to go wrong. He didn't know it yet, but fate, with its invisible hands, was already beginning to shape the tragedy that was about to unfold. Oedipus and Jocasta's happiness, however, was accompanied by a growing concern for the future of Thebes. While the people lived in prosperity, a shadow loomed over the kingdom. Something, somewhere, was about to disrupt the harmony that had been so carefully built. And for the king, doubts about his past continued to haunt him, unanswered. Meanwhile, their children were growing, and life seemed to follow its tranquil course. But in Oedipus's heart, the question lingered. Was he truly free from everything the oracle had predicted? He felt that a dark cloud was forming on the horizon, though he didn't know it was approaching relentlessly. The peaceful days of Thebes were about to be interrupted by a calamity no one could predict. Despite all the prosperity and peace achieved with so much effort, something dark was spreading throughout the city, something that even the wise and just Oedipus could never have imagined. A deadly plague began spreading rapidly across Thebes. The crops withered, the cattle died, and the people were consumed by disease. Citizens began falling ill one by one, and panic took over the streets. Entire families perished, with no one knowing how to stop the epidemic. Fear spread faster than the sickness itself, and soon the city was in complete chaos. The people of Thebes, desperate, searched in all directions for a solution. There was no cure for the disease, and the gods, who had once seemed to bless the kingdom, appeared to have turned their backs. The atmosphere of despair overtook the city, and all eyes turned to the Oracle of Delphi, hoping for an answer. When the news of the plague reached the palace, Oedipus immediately summoned the priests and asked for an explanation. He knew that something more was at play, that this wasn't just a simple disease that could be eradicated with medicine or ordinary prayers. The curse weighing over the city seemed more than a mere accident. He didn't know what had caused the plague, but he was certain its origin lay somewhere within Thebes. Desperate, Oedipus sent Creon, his brother-in-law, to the Oracle of Delphi to seek answers. When Creon returned, he brought a revelation that would alter the course of everything Oedipus thought he knew. The oracle, with its enigmatic voice, revealed that the plague would not be removed until the murderer of Laius, the former king, was found and punished. This announcement shocked Oedipus to his core. Laius, the former king, was a man he knew, had ruled Thebes before his arrival, but he never imagined that Laius's death was connected to the current calamity. Tragedy had settled so subtly, and the truth that was still hidden began to reveal itself in a devastating way. Determined to save his city, Oedipus swore to find the one responsible for Laius's death and purify Thebes of its curse. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to make a discovery that would destroy him forever. Now, with the oracle's revelation in mind, Oedipus found himself immersed in a mission that would consume all his strength: to find Laius's killer and end the plague that was ravaging Thebes. He had no doubt he would solve this mystery, just as he had with the Sphinx, believing that the truth, as always, was within his reach. In his speech to the people, Oedipus made a solemn vow. "I swear by the gods that I will do whatever it takes to find the culprit and avenge the death of Laius, to save this city from the curse that consumes us." The people of Thebes, who had always adored him as a hero, responded with hope, believing that their king would free them once more. The search began, and Oedipus gathered his best advisors, including the wise Tiresias, the blind seer, who was respected for his vision of the beyond and his ability to see what others could not. However, when Oedipus summoned Tiresias for help, he encountered an unexpected resistance. The seer hesitated, as if he knew something terrible, something that couldn't be said. As time passed, the pressure increased. Oedipus pressed Tiresias until the blind man, reluctant, gave in and revealed something horrible. "You, Oedipus, are the murderer of Laius." These words hit like a bomb, and the king, stunned, didn't know how to react. "Me! How could it be me?" Oedipus shouted, incredulous. He was certain of his innocence. He, who had ruled with justice, who had saved Thebes, couldn't possibly be the guilty one. Tiresias, unshaken, responded, "You don't see, Oedipus. You solved the riddle of the Sphinx, but now the greatest mystery is the one closest to you than you realize. The fate has already been sealed." But Oedipus, in his rage and confusion, did not believe the prophet's words. Instead, he accused Tiresias and his brother Creon of conspiring against him, perhaps out of envy for the throne. He clung to his own vision, certain that something was being plotted against him. Determined to continue his investigation, Oedipus ordered that every detail of Laius's death be re-examined. that all witnesses be interrogated. With each clue that arose, his mind delved deeper into the web of mystery. However, the king could not see that the answers had been right in front of him all along, and that the darkest of enigmas had already begun to slowly reveal itself. Oedipus's search for the truth led him to a crucial moment, the meeting with Tiresias, the great blind prophet. For days, Oedipus tried to piece together the puzzle, speaking to witnesses and examining the past of the kingdom of Thebes. He knew there was something more he didn't yet understand, something fundamental that escaped his perception. That was why he summoned Tiresias, a man whose powers were revered, to shed light on the path. When the prophet arrived at the palace, his serious demeanor and firm posture indicated that he carried a heavy burden. He was a respected man, but also feared, for his vision was not like that of others. He saw beyond the reach of mortals, and this allowed him to perceive truths that others preferred to ignore. Yet, Tiresias hesitated to give Oedipus the answers he so desperately sought. He knew the king was not prepared for what was to come. Impatient, Oedipus questioned him urgently. "Tiresias, tell me, who is Laius's murderer? What is keeping this plague upon our city?" But Tiresias, with a heavy sigh, responded, "You are not ready to hear, Oedipus. The truth is an unbearable weight, and I do not have the right to carry this pain for you." Oedipus, confused and frustrated, insisted, "I am the king. I command this city for the good of all. The plague is destroying our people, and I will not rest until I find the culprit. If you know the truth, speak now." Finally, Tiresias relented, but his words were like sharp blades. "You, Oedipus, are the murderer of Laius. You are responsible for our misfortune." These words struck Oedipus like a lightning bolt. He looked at the prophet, incredulous, as if he were hearing a lie. "Me? How dare you accuse me of such a horrible thing? I who saved this city, I who am the king. You must be mad." Tiresias, with sorrow in his eyes, simply replied, "You are blind, Oedipus, and do not see what is right before you. The truth is in your blood, but you refuse to acknowledge it." But Oedipus, filled with rage and denial, turned against the prophet. "You and Creon are conspiring against me. It's clear there's a plot to bring me down. You will try to manipulate the gods to destroy me, but you will not succeed." And so, with one last look of desolation, Tiresias withdrew, leaving Oedipus alone, more confused and furious than ever. The king believed he was being betrayed, and the truth still seemed distant, hidden somewhere he did not want to see. After the dramatic revelation from Tiresias, Oedipus was completely shaken. The accusation of being Laius's murderer reverberated in his mind like a distant echo, impossible to ignore, but he refused to accept it. How could he? He who had saved Thebes from the Sphinx, who had been exalted as the hero of all, now being accused of such an atrocity. The idea was unsustainable. Rage consumed Oedipus, and his vision became clouded by indignation. He became convinced that there was something much more complex behind Tiresias's words. The king's mind, once so logical and strategic, was now overtaken by paranoia. He could not accept that he himself was the key to the mystery, so he began to suspect a conspiracy against him. It's impossible. Tiresias must be manipulated. Creon must be behind this, he thought. The idea of his own brother-in-law, Creon, conspiring against him was unbearable. Creon had always held a position of trust in the kingdom, but now, in his distorted mind, Oedipus saw him as a traitor. Perhaps he and the blind prophet were united in an attempt to usurp the throne. Maybe they wanted to bring him down so that Creon could rule Thebes in his place. Furious, Oedipus summoned Creon for an audience, determined to confront him. When Creon entered the room, he immediately sensed the heavy air of tension in the atmosphere. Oedipus's gaze was filled with accusation and distrust. "Creon, You and Tiresias are trying to bring me down, aren't you? Oedipus asked firmly, not hiding his anger. You and the blind prophet are conspiring against my rule, against the throne of Thebes. I always trusted you, but now I see that you have secret intentions. What do you want? Power for yourself. Creon, stunned and outraged by the accusation, tried to calm the king. No, Oedipus, you are mistaken. I never thought of usurping your power. I have only sought the good of Thebes, and what I have sought is to save the kingdom from the plague. You can't believe I would do such a thing. But Oedipus, immersed in his own fury, refused to listen. He was blinded by suspicion, unable to see the truth. To him, everything seemed too clear. Creon and Tiresias were united, and their only mission was to take him down. The king did not realize that his relentless search for a logical explanation was blinding him even further to reality. And so the accusation extended, and the distance between him and the truth grew even greater. The argument with Creon ended tensely, unresolved, and Oedipus's anger only grew. He was trapped in a web of distrust that kept him further and further from what he truly needed, the truth. As Oedipus still wrestled with the suspicions and rage that consumed him, an unexpected figure entered the scene. A messenger from Corinth arrived at the palace with news that under normal circumstances would have brought relief to any monarch. The death of Polybus, the king of Corinth, the man Oedipus had always believed to be his father. The messenger arrived with a serious expression, but his demeanor softened with a respectful gesture toward the king. "Great Oedipus," he began with a bow, "I bring news from your homeland. Polybus, your adoptive father, has passed away. He is no longer among the living." At first, Oedipus breathed a sigh of relief. He had worried that he might have been the cause of Polybus's death, as the oracle had warned, but the messenger brought the good news that his real father had not been murdered by him, as the prophecy suggested. The weight of one part of the curse seemed to have been lifted, and this brought the king a brief moment of relief. "There is no reason to fear the fate the oracle predicted," Oedipus said, relieved. "Fate has failed. Polybus died a natural death like any man of his age. I am not responsible for his death." However, the messenger, sensing Oedipus's unease, said, "There is something else I must tell you, my king. Although Polybus has died, you are not his true son. I am the one who found you as a baby, abandoned, and I took you to the king and queen of Corinth. You were not born to Polybus and Merope, but were adopted by them. You, Oedipus, are the son of Laius and Jocasta, the king and queen of Thebes." These words hit Oedipus like a storm. The world around him seemed to stop spinning. He stood frozen, in silence, as the pieces of his life, those he had believed to be simple and well-defined, began to fit together in an unexpected and horrifying way. The idea of being the son of Laius, the former king of Thebes, and Jocasta, his wife, was inconceivable. He who had always believed himself to be the son of Polybus and Merope now had to confront the truth that the prophecy, which he thought he had escaped, was true in all its magnitude. He had killed his true father and, as the oracle had said, was destined to marry his own mother. Desperate, Oedipus paused, trying to piece together the fragments of his thoughts. The messenger continued, unaware of the depth of the abyss he had just opened. "I, the man who found you, and who always knew your origin, feared that you might find out one day. But now, after Polybus's death, I believe the time has come. The revelation was complete, and the devastating truth took over Oedipus. He, who had tirelessly sought the culprit for Laius's death and the curse of Thebes, now understood that he himself was the key to the suffering that befell the kingdom. He had killed his father, as the oracle had predicted, and now he was married to his mother, unknowingly. The messenger's revelation was like a sharp blade cutting through the fog. that surrounded Oedipus's understanding. The king was paralyzed, as if the weight of the truth had crushed him. Everything he had lived, all of his choices, now seemed meaningless in the face of this new and terrifying reality. He stepped away from the messenger, his trembling hands seeking support from a nearby table. The air felt heavier. The palace walls seemed to close in, and the ground beneath his feet became unstable. "No, this can't be true," he murmured, more to himself than to the messenger. But deep down, he knew it was. The prophecy had been cruelly and relentlessly fulfilled. Oedipus knew he needed more answers, and quickly. He turned to Jocasta, his wife, and the only person who could help him understand what was happening. She, who had seemed calm and confident until that moment, had also begun to perceive the terrible truth, but it was too late to hide what was already clear. When Jocasta entered the room, Oedipus stared at her, his gaze filled with a mixture of hopelessness and questioning. "Jocasta, did you know?" he asked, his voice hoarse, pain in every word. "Did you know that Laius and I were the same man, that the prophecy was true, and that you, my wife, were my mother?" Jocasta, hearing Oedipus's words, fell into a moment of absolute silence. Her face paled, and a deep chill surrounded her. She, who had tried to deny the truth all those years, could no longer hide. The weight of the revelation hit her like an avalanche, and the horror in her eyes could not be disguised. She stammered, trying to find something to say, some explanation, but the words failed her. I didn't know," she began, but her voice was smothered by the growing wave of anguish that took over her heart. Oedipus, unable to bear the suffering, looked at her in despair. "Jocasta, how could we have been so blind? How could we have lived with this lie for so long? What happened to Laius wasn't a random tragedy. It was destiny crushing us, and now we're condemned to pay for it." Jocasta, already consumed by guilt and despair, could bear no more. The shame and horror overwhelmed her, and she ran to her chambers, fleeing from the reality that surrounded her. Oedipus, for his part, could no longer bear his own existence. He had fulfilled the prophecy unknowingly, and now the pain of his fate was more than he could endure. Oedipus was in shock. The truth, finally revealed, destroyed everything he thought he knew about himself. The weight of his discovery crushed his soul, and the palace, once a fortress of authority, now felt like a cold, dark prison. Every corner seemed to whisper what he desperately didn't want to hear, but there was no escaping fate. He moved away, from where Jocasta had fled, trying to organize his confused thoughts. His feet, once so firm and confident, now seemed unsteady. He felt lost, as if the ground beneath him was disintegrating. He looked at the messenger, who stood by, helpless, in the face of the king's suffering, but Oedipus no longer saw him. His mind was elsewhere, already connecting past events to the horrific reality of the present. Then, a distant memory emerged in his mind. He remembered the day, when he was young and full of doubts, that he had visited the Oracle of Delphi. At that time he had sought the truth about his origins, hoping to dispel the fear of the prophecy that tormented him. The oracle, as always, had spoken in riddles. But now he understood. The prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother had never been a simple threat. It was a warning from fate that he could not escape, no matter how hard he tried. Everything clicked into place. He remembered the encounter with Laius on a lonely road, where the argument that started over a simple misunderstanding ended with him killing the man who he now knew was his true father. That man, whom he didn't know, whom he had killed in a fit of rage, but who, at the same time, was fulfilling the first part of the prophecy, the path laid out by forces beyond human control. Oedipus' mind raced frantically, connecting every piece of the story. The blood he had spilled on the road, the desperate search for an identity that was never his, the mysteries he had tried to solve with so much effort, all of it was part of a fate he could not alter. He looked at his hands, now marked by the choices and tragedies he could not undo. How could he have been so blind, so trusting in his own assumptions? How could he have believed that he could escape what was written? And as this flood of thoughts tormented his mind, he began to understand what, until that moment, had seemed inconceivable. The past and the present were intertwined in a way he had never imagined. What he had done years ago, what he had done on that lonely road, had inevitably led to this moment. He wasn't just being punished for something he had done, he was living the consequences of a path that had been laid out for him long before his birth. Oedipus sat down, his eyes vacant, trying to process everything he had just learned. Every part of the story he thought he knew now seemed like a distant fiction, and he saw himself as just a pawn in the hands of a cruel fate. But deep down, he knew the truth had come to light, and nothing could change it. The pain was unbearable. The palace of Thebes, which had once been the setting for parties and celebrations, now felt like a tomb, so heavy with sadness and despair. Jocasta, upon hearing Oedipus's words, was consumed by an anguish so deep she could no longer bear the weight of her own existence. The understanding of the truth, which she had desperately tried to avoid, had torn away the veil of illusion that had surrounded her. What had been impossible to believe before now was an irrefutable fact. She had married her own son, and unknowingly had been the cause of the curse that had destroyed everything she loved. She locked herself in her chambers, distancing herself from Oedipus, who was still struggling to comprehend the magnitude of his personal tragedy. She could no longer face the world, not even her own son. She felt as if the weight of everything she had done and everything fate had imposed on them was impossible to carry. Jocasta ran into her room, her eyes already clouded with shame and pain. There was no more room for redemption, and the truth consumed her whole. She sat down, thoughts swirling in her mind but unable to find an escape. Her eyes fell on the tie that held her robe, and it was as if something inside her snapped. Gradually, her consciousness faded, and in an act of irreparable desperation, she took the cord from her dress and used it to hang herself. In the moment, her life slipped away. Jocasta felt a brief sense of relief, as if she could finally escape the eternal punishment that her own blood had imposed on her. The news of her death quickly reached Oedipus, who, upon hearing of his mother's desperate act, completely lost himself. There was no longer any reason to fight against the fate that had already crushed him, and the guilt that now flowed in his veins like poison went beyond what anyone could imagine. He could no longer see himself as the man he once was, the king who ruled Thebes with authority. He was now the man who had destroyed his own lineage, unknowingly, unwillingly, but still completely responsible. The palace, once vibrant with life, was now filled with complete desolation. The loss of Jocasta was the final blow that sealed the fate of all involved. There was no redemption left, no escape. All that remained was the void of regret and pain. The death of Jocasta was the final blow that broke Oedipus. The man he thought was the hero of Thebes, the king who ruled with justice, was now nothing more than a shadow of his former self. The tragedy had consumed him completely, and he found himself plunged into an abyss of guilt and despair. The palace, where he had once reigned with strength and wisdom, now seemed like a place of eternal punishment. After learning of the death of his mother, his wife, Oedipus found no reason to continue living. He no longer wanted to be king, no longer wanted to bear the burden of leadership. How could he? How could he rule a kingdom, knowing he was the cause of so many tragedies? His mind, clouded by pain, could no longer think clearly. The guilt suffocated him, and he knew nothing could undo the actions he had committed. Nothing could erase the truth of his lineage and the horrors fate had imposed upon him. Unable to bear the sight of himself any longer, Oedipus sought a punishment that matched what he felt in his heart. He recalled a deep and symbolic pain, blindness. It was blindness that had prevented him from seeing the truth of his origin, and it was blindness that now condemned him. He wanted to punish the blindness of his soul with physical blindness. With trembling hands, Oedipus took a pin from Jocasta's dress, the same pin she had worn while alive. He held it tightly, feeling the cold metal, and with a silent scream of agony, he began to pierce his own eyes. The physical pain was unbearable, but nothing compared to the torment he felt inside. Each movement of the pin, each act of self-punishment, was a desperate attempt to atone for his sins. Finally, he went blind, and the silence that followed was deafening. The palace, which now seemed like a distant echo of its former splendor, reflected the emptiness within him. There was no more sight, no more path to follow. He who had once been the king of Thebes was now a man without eyes, without a kingdom, without hope. Completely devastated, Oedipus collapsed to the ground, powerless, unwilling to live, but also lacking the courage to die. He had fulfilled the prophecy in a terrible way, and now fate once again took everything from him. With his face stained with tears and blood, he lifted his head, hearing only the echoes of the suffering in his life. Blindness was now his only companion. The kingdom of Thebes, once full of life and prosperity under Oedipus's reign, was now plunged into chaos. The king, blinded by his own guilt, had renounced the throne. His suffering was too great to be borne by anyone, and the weight of his punishment led him to an inevitable fate, exile. He no longer deserved to live in Thebes, no longer deserved the honor of ruling, for the only wish he had now was to leave his land and disappear forever. Antigone, his daughter, was the only one who remained by his side. She, though young and fragile, was strong enough to support her father in his pain. The man who had once been the king of Thebes now saw himself as a lost man, with no identity, no place in the world. But Antigone, with her immeasurable compassion, did not hesitate to become his beacon, his guide through the darkness. She accompanied him on his journey of exile, caring for him as he walked in silence, his eyes empty, following a destiny charted by the cruel hand of fate. The people of Thebes, who had once revered him, now found themselves before a desolate city, without a leader, without direction. Creon, Oedipus's brother-in-law, took over the government, although he was no longer the strong and respected man he had once been. The kingdom was marked by the curse and the pain, and everyone knew that Oedipus's tragedy would never be forgotten. Meanwhile, Oedipus and Antigone traveled through foreign lands, far from the streets he once walked as a monarch. Exile was relentless, but necessary for the cycle of suffering to end. Oedipus, blind and hopeless, spent his final days as a wandering man, always accompanied by the daughter who loved him and gave him strength to continue. In silence, he reflected on the mistakes he had made, on how his attempts to avoid fate had only hastened his downfall. The pain he now carried was beyond words, beyond any punishment he could have imagined, but there was something in his suffering that seemed more noble than anything else. He had accepted his guilt, his responsibility, and was fulfilling his sentence with bitter resignation. He knew there was no turning back, that the life he had once had was irretrievably lost. Oedipus walked without looking back, in search of an uncertain destiny. He knew death would eventually come, but until then, he would be lost, wandering the corners of the world. And so, with the shadow of fate following him, he spent the last years of his life. The tragedy of Oedipus left a deep mark on the history of Thebes and, more broadly, on Greek culture. His story spread throughout the ancient world, and the echoes of his pain reached even the following generations, giving rise to a legacy that would extend beyond the limits of time. His journey of self-discovery and his struggle against the inevitable fate became a classic example of the conflict between man and the cosmic forces that govern the universe. The concept of fate, which could not be avoided even by the best intentions, became a central theme in Greek tragedies, with Oedipus being the most dramatic example of how even the most powerful kings were at the mercy of something greater than themselves. His story not only emphasized fatalism, but also warned about human arrogance in trying to control the uncontrollable. However, Oedipus's legacy was not limited to literature. The tragedy of his life also resonated in philosophy and psychoanalysis. In the 20th century, psychologist Sigmund Freud used the story of Oedipus as the foundation for his theory of the Oedipus complex, a fundamental concept in psychoanalysis. Freud suggested that men have an unconscious tendency to desire their mothers and rival their fathers, an idea that sparked heated debates and left an indelible mark on modern psychology. The complexity of Oedipus's relationship with his parents, his struggle against the prophecy, his grief, and his attempt to avoid his fate became central not only in the field of psychology, but also in reflections on human nature, family relationships, and suffering. Furthermore, the story of Oedipus would continue to inspire great literary works from later playwrights and writers who saw in him a clear example of human tragedy. Plays like OedipusRex, written by Sophocles, became landmarks of Greek theatre and continue to be staged and reinterpreted to this day, showing how the struggle against fate and the search for truth can be universal and timeless themes. The story of Oedipus also influenced Western literature in general, with many writers using the idea of inevitable tragedy to explore the moral dilemmas and destinies of their characters. The figure of Oedipus, the common man who becomes king, but is dragged by forces beyond his understanding, became a powerful symbol of how our choices, no matter how conscious we try to be, can lead us to destinies we cannot foresee or control. But in the end, Oedipus's legacy is, above all, a reminder of the inescapable power of fate. His life, marked by the attempt to escape a prophecy that would come true regardless, reflects the struggle of all of us against what we cannot change, and at the same time, the realization that, in the end, we are all in some way prisoners of fate. And so, the story of Oedipus is not just about the suffering of one man. It is about the human condition, about the limits of human control, about the recognition that no matter how hard we try, sometimes we are destined to follow a path that was charted long before we were born. The tragedy of Oedipus lives on, not only in the texts that have survived through the centuries, but also in all of us, in the choices, the consequences, and the eternal conflict between will and destiny. And so, we come to the end of the tragic story of Oedipus, a tale of fate, guilt, and self-reflection that makes us question how far we can control our lives. If you enjoyed this video and were touched by the story, don't forget to leave a comment below, telling us what impacted you the most in Oedipus's journey. If you liked it, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now so you won't miss any more videos about mythology, fascinating stories, and much more. Until next time, and remember, fate may be unpredictable, but you can always make a difference with your choices.